It's ad break time. I'm pleased to announce that the Beyond Solitaire podcast remains proudly sponsored by Central Michigan University's Center for Learning Through Games and Simulations. This week I have a very special announcement, which is that I will once again be teaching a class for their certificate in applied game design. Come take Using Games to Teach What You Can Convey Through Play with yours truly. The class runs from January 22nd to February 29th, and I would love to see you there. A link to the registration page is in the show notes. CLGS's latest game, 500-Year-Old Vampire, just finished a very successful campaign, but if you forgot to back it, you can now pre-order through BackerKit. The link is also in the show notes. I also want to plug my own Patreon. Your support means a lot to me, both emotionally and financially. Patreon money is what makes it possible to keep improving my channel by upgrading the equipment, and I'm also hoping to increase the amount of videos I can publish over the course of the next year. If you want to help out, head over to patreon.com/BeyondSolitaire. For now, though, let's get on with the show. Hey gamers, it's Liz Davidson from Beyond Solitaire, and today on the pod I have two very special guests, and they are both repeat guests. So I'm just bringing my friends together for a chat. I have Jason from Shelf Stories. How you doing, Jason?
Yo, my peoples, what's up?
And I have my friend Paul Wright, who is a scholar, a teacher, and also one of my current co-designers on a game project. So how you doing, Paul?
Good. Thinking about our game, of course.
You better
Top
be.
cook. You can't stop.
Yeah.
Once it's in there, unless it reaches like a point where you can hand it off to something, and it's just always there.
It's always on your mind. Yeah.
But today we're going to get together to talk about a really huge game, and that would be Mr. President, because I feel like that one landed
Give
like
the full subtitle.
It's the American Presidency 2001 to 2020. Is that where it stops? Yeah.
They don't get into the pandemic, but yeah, 2001 to 2020. So whatever association people have, yes, they tried to jam it at some level in this game. Yes,
indeed. I prefer to think of it as Dr. President, but it's fine. But this game hit the war game scene, especially like an asteroid. It's the size of an asteroid when it arrives at your door. And it's probably the largest and most just kind of lengthy setup, lengthy figure out how to play it, like 8 manuals game that I've ever seen. And yet it is a very captivating game. And it has really, like, it appeared on the top solo historical games list that Brant from the Armchair Dragoons and I put together this year. So Paul, Jason and I have each played the game once, because it took time. You've played it several times, which is why you're on here. So do you want to give us like a rundown of what's going on in Mr. President?
Sure. So I've played it about 4 times on my own. The 4th time at, I think, the normal difficulty, which is plenty hard. And that took me through 2 terms. I actually got through 2 terms, which was kind of my goal. And I'm currently playing it online via Vassal with 2 friends, one of whom is a retired Air Force colonel and military intelligence analyst, and the other of whom is a sociologist, and we're old friends and gaming partners. And that game is right in the middle. It is a game that can work better online sometimes because of the footprint of the actual game, which I love having out on a table. I have the right table for it, but it is a slog to set it all up and to get it going. And it's a game you're not going to finish in an afternoon. It's a game you're not going to finish probably in a week. It's a time commitment. But if you can afford to leave it set up, it's quite engrossing. It covers all the domestic challenges of an American president alongside all the foreign policy challenges. So there are really 2 halves to the game and 2 halves to the board. And the way the designer puts it is you can lose the game in the foreign policy arena, and you're trying to avoid losing the game there. You can win the game in the domestic arena. And so you have to pay attention to both sides, and it's a constant balancing act. That'd be the short version.
So how long are your play sessions for it? And then like how often, like how many play sessions of that does it take to finish the game? Just out of curiosity.
Yeah, so my current group, again, we're taking a solo game and playing it three-headed. Basically, I'm playing the president. My friend Brent Griffin, the Air Force colonel, is handling the military and foreign policy issues, diplomatic issues. And my friend Andrew Rowan, who's a sociologist, is my chief of staff handling the domestic front. It's really an interesting and engaging game played with others, actually. I think I kind of prefer it this way because there's really a consultative process, much like a presidential cabinet, that I think helps you play the game and in certain ways makes you play it better. We play once a week for about 2 hours on Vassal, and we've done about, my count is about 10 sessions, and we have just finished the first 2 years and gotten through the midterm elections, and we're heading forward from that. So it takes time, partly because you're online, you're dealing with Discord, you're dealing with all the technological things that can slow you down as much as help you. But we really have enjoyed it. We play so many different things together. You've played with Brent, Liz, in Republic of Rome.
I have. That
Yeah,
traitorous man.
yeah, he was there. But it's been a blast. I actually think I prefer it this way.
That's awesome.
I mean, in terms of the mechanisms, like the actual play experience, like, you know, it's not a game where you have like avatars, right? You don't, like you said, mentioned for Secretary of State and all that kind of thing. Like you don't have like a piece, right? And so I guess we could try to paint a word picture for people who are listening on the podcast or haven't seen it. It The way I describe it, it's more like 3 or 4 separate board games kind of together, right? So they all kind of work the same. Like, you know, I think we think like heavy game, right? I'm coming at it from like a Euro paradigm, and this is very different from a Euro paradigm. So in a Euro kind of way, a heavy quote unquote Euro game, you're you're doing one move, you get resources, and then you turn the resources into something else, and you turn, you know, and it's like there's this kind of like building stuff, and it's like points. It's almost like an abundance paradigm in Euro games. Here, no, there's not a lot of abundance here. It is a crisis management game at the end of the day, and there are a number of tracks. This game is tracks, more tracks, and everything. You get tracks for the domestic side really has a lot of the tracks, and then you have you know, the different things like you'd have to remember like cyber, and you know, you can kind of all these things that you can improve space, and you know, as you improve these things, generally it's not really like you're getting that many bonuses. You're really kind of outpacing your enemies, the Russians, the Chinese, and all that kind of thing. And so when you do a thing, which mostly it's like, okay, I'm going to address this thing, and you get like, I think what, 20, 25 action points, depending on what mode you're playing in. So it sounds like a lot of action points. There's a lot of phases.
They go in
Yeah,
a
you
hurry.
can really run out.
There is a lot of phases. Like you know, each one of these things, like, you know, each within the domestic sphere, there's all these things to do, and then within the foreign sphere, there's all these things to do. Like the actual action track is what, 25 spaces long, and it's like this kind of like snake. It's not a snake track, but like you're constantly checking. Okay, this phase, and there's certain things that only the president can do. There's certain things that only Secretary of State. Well, the Secretary of State can do. The president could do everything. They could take every action, but the Secretary of State is empowered to take actions in the foreign area, and they get like certain bonuses. It depending on like if your Secretary of State has inherent bonuses, and you pick kind of your cabinet at the beginning of the game. That's random. That could be fun. But like you get certain bonuses depending on what kind of Secretary of State you have, and it's like, okay, they have a +1 to this role, +1 to that role, etc. Dealing with different threats. And if you're talking about the foreign area, then there's like, you know, the Middle East and Africa and all these other places. Then you have within those things, okay, how are they doing? Are they your ally? Are they you know, hotbeds of civil war? You know, are they developing little rogue states? And you have to deal with the rogue states. And so as you take actions in these areas, basically the paradigm is calm it down, you know, or manage it. Okay, look, I can let that one inflame while I work on this thing, etc. So you're always kind of balancing these things. And I mean, I think just from a Eurogamer's perspective, it's not a case where you do a thing, you get like a resource, you get whatever. You're managing a crisis. It's like that's what you get. You get a managed crisis. There are some little things we can get into that in terms of like what is it called, the DRM, the dice modifier roll? Is that
Yes.
the DRM?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That's like the big thing, right? So a lot of the game funnels towards, if you achieve like a really great success, you get a DRM. A lot of it's like, okay. And so this is something that we're going to talk, I imagine, a fair bit about in terms of the mechanisms, the dice. This game
Yes.
is dicey.
It's a lot of rolling.
It's very dicey. Yeah, I mean, this game is,
for a game this big, and that's another thing that a quote unquote big Euro game, and this is kind of bring it solidly towards the war game traditional paradigm. Pretty much every time you want to make progress on a track, you're adding up your bonuses. What does the president get? What does your other pieces get? What is the state of the economy? What is the state of that? You're kind of looking at this entire big thing. What pluses do I get? What are my modifiers? How can I apply my DRMs? And you roll a D10. Boom. You either get it or you don't, and you can spend an action point to re-roll, but you don't get a lot of mitigation. Like, I think the game wants to, like, okay, no, this was bad. You have to deal with whatever that is, no matter your best laid plans, if you miss the roll, you got to deal with it. And I think what the game wants to do is, because that sounds like rough, but I think what the game wants to put forward is there's so many rolls and there's so much to do that
yes.
if you have like a typical bell curve of rolls, then some are going to work out, some are not going to work out, and the game will kind of like move you along that way. It's not going to kind of handhold you and be like, okay, here, you missed that roll. Okay, get this token, you get the next. No, you're not. It's not going to do that.
Yeah. The rolls are a big part of my mental understanding of the game, but it's also, I don't know, I kind of feel like it's really game of just, it's so many charts.
Yeah, it's 7 charts in one. Yes.
It's like you want to give attention to everything. It's the ultimate in spinning plates. You have a bunch of plates spinning. You try not to let them drop. You're gonna have to let something drop because maybe the rolls aren't with you, or you don't have enough actions because it never feels like there's enough action points in a year. Even if you're playing on like easy, that wouldn't even be like I played normal, but there's still there's so
I guess like
so
it depends.
little points.
I'll put a pin in that. Just it depends. I think there's going to be a want to, like, I want to take care of a lot of things, and these are all important. And I think the game wants to educate you and say, no, you must decide which things you're going to let go to hell.
Oh, yeah.
And which,
but
like, this is a decision you must make. And, you're because the goal of the game is to basically get through the 4 years. Like, and that's really like the overarching goal of the game. And you don't have to get to in that sterling condition. Like, if you play on an easier mode, it's easier. You can, really romp. But normal, like, as Paul can attest to, and as I was able to kind of piece together, because I played like a easy first year and then a normal first year, and the difference is massive.
It is.
And
yeah.
And in easy, you can kind of like feel really good and feel like you've done a lot. But in normal mode, and you can Paul can break down the difference, what they did to make that different. Like, it was like I'm looking at fires. I'm just
So fundamentally, from a mechanic standpoint, you'll end up with fewer action points and resources in general if you're playing normal versus easy, let alone hard. I haven't even tried that yet. Another difference is on easy mode, you can call on a built-in modifier in your favor to just about any dice roll. That felt too easy and gamey to me, so I kind of quickly moved past it. But then came all the anguish and struggle that came with playing it on normal mode. The way I would put it, I was reminded in thinking about the game of the old Yakov Smirnoff jokes about the Soviet Union, right? And the version for this game would be Mr. President, in Mr. President, game plays you. And that is sometimes how you feel. You feel like you are hostage to all these different things that are happening all at once that you can't control. You will not get your way on most things, sometimes on nothing. And so what you were talking about, Liz, in terms of the plate spinning, whack-a-mole, whatever you'd want to call it, that's how it feels to manage the problems. And I think the trade-off is, if you like emergent narrative, there are a few games that are going to give you as much an emergent narrative as this, including over repeat plays where the situation can be drastically different. I found each game to have a very different feel, very different problems. That's in part a credit to the vast number of events that have been created for the game and the variety in how each event can roll out. So even the same event won't roll out exactly the same way in each game. So if you like emergent narrative, great game for you. You have to have, I would say, though, a certain tolerance, and I would even say appetite, for being overwhelmed by contingencies and for being unable to achieve everything you want to achieve all the time. If your goal in playing a game is to have a strong, almost unchallenged sense of agency and autonomy, this may not be the game for you. You're going to have to make your peace with the cognitive dissonance that comes with trying to manage affairs that are beyond any one person's control, any one nation's control. And I think for me, I have that appetite. I like that kind of challenge. So this will absorb me, draw me in, keep me playing for years. I have no doubt about it. Even with the areas in which I would have done things differently, or I have my own concerns, but it is certainly engaging if you can stomach that lack of control, because there will be times when, as Jason was saying, you'll just have to let something go and realize, I can't fix that. I can't change that. I can mitigate it a little. I can try and reduce the impact of the problem, but I'm not going to erase it. And sometimes that's a foreign policy problem, but it's also a domestic problem sometimes. You can have problems at home. One thing I would observe, and Jason probably noticed this too, and Liz in your plays, on the domestic front in terms of politics and policy and party, the game never specifies your political party.
Right. No, and a lot of that is very smoothed out.
Yes, and the game never specifies necessarily your particular positions on a given issue. So you might be advancing a bill through Congress on military spending or energy independence or immigration or whatever, but you actually don't have the game spell out for you what your party's position on that is, or what you personally have a position on that as president. I do think narratively, the people playing the game, especially when more than one person is playing it, they can fill in those blanks. So we have found in the 3-player game that we have talked about policy specifics that the game is more or less agnostic on from a mechanics point of view. And I think there are different feelings about that. I've seen critiques of the game because it hasn't been more specific. And I've seen people celebrate that because they say, well, it gets beyond the usual party dynamics of the country we know right now. And it doesn't say that those things don't matter, but it posits that you as president are dealing with pressures coming at you from all sides, from the populace at large, from your own party, from people across the aisle in Congress, right? All these different factions are calling on you to support their vision of things. And so you're trying to advance your vision of things in the midst of that. And so you can play it without ever going deeper into those issues in terms of what your legislation would actually look like. Yeah. But I personally enjoy trying to imagine what our legislation looks like and what we're trying to say by way of great society initiatives or anything else of that nature that we're trying to develop.
Yeah, I mean, so it's okay, good economy, right? And so like your tracker is good and bad, and different parties are going to have different ideas of what a good economy is. So like, a Democrat in traditional American politics would, a lot of government spending, a lot of, generous programs and all that kind of thing, at least in the traditional paradigm. And then the Republican would be like, that's bad. Like, and there's a lot of conservatives think the whole New Deal was bad. Right. And like we kind of eviscerated the country by instituting the New Deal, and we got better when we started cutting taxes and cutting programs and that kind of stuff. This game is silent on all that. I would say like this game felt like West Wing, the board game, in a lot of ways. So West Wing, if you saw it, I mean, West Wing, they would get into like the politics and everything and the policies, but that wasn't the big thing, the center. It was more just like the president as a successful person. And no matter what policy, is the president successful? Is the president in charge, and is the president managing conflicts? And in terms of what the game is trying to evoke, I mean, you could spend 20 hours like playing like a full thing. And over the course of that 20 hours, I think the sense is you want to get like a full season of a show of West Wing. Like you want to be like, okay, the highs and the lows, and I had things managed to this point, and then this crisis came in and I had to respond to it, and I've been working on my cyber for and then all of a sudden, wham, the Russians sped past me because of other things. And like the game really prides itself on these like not a sitcom, but like a procedural ongoing serialized show type moments, and putting you in the active role and responding to these moments. And it's in that, like, I think the beginning of the game was like 10 years ago, right, or something like that. Like, this game's been in development a very, very long time. Before George Floyd, before, this was in, like, I think the Obama years was when this started. And I think that was the kind of height. People call it, like, quote unquote neoliberalism and whatever. But I think the idea was, like, the government is like a big technical problem to be solved. And this game is basically a dashboard that presents a whole bunch of problems in the most technical way possible. The rogue state is here. How are you going to solve that technical problem? If you do that, then you're going to do this. And if you pay attention to that, then you're not like, it's so technical, and it just feels it's almost like playing like a something from a different time. In terms of because we don't think about that way now. We're much more like, tribal. We're much more like, aware of marginalized people, for better or for worse, however that works. We don't, and a lot more skeptical of government in our day in 2023. So this almost feels like it parachuted in from 10 years ago in terms of how it conceives of the overall process of government.
Is it bad that made me feel nostalgic too? Like, sometimes I look back at those years like, oh yes, back when we were watching the Obama-Romney debates in college. It was so civil compared to what it was.
John McCain was saying, oh no, we have to respect Obama. Don't call him an Arab. We have to assert comedy and everything. It's very much that, like, there's no substantive difference between, like, Bush and Obama. They're all trying to manage the problems in their own way.
I like Jason's evocation of West Wing. I think that's a good touch point. I also think, along the lines of what he was talking about, he said the game is like a cockpit, or you could say like a ship of state, and you're trying to navigate it. And what you discover, usually the hard way, is if you're trying to turn a massive ship, think an aircraft carrier, you can't turn on a dime. There are glacial processes at work in everything you want to do in the game, and you have to have a certain tolerance for that as well. The dopamine hit that comes from great games, you'll get it, but it is going to be delayed, and you're going to have to earn it.
Very much late gratification. So, like, if something blows up in the Middle East, right? Let's say you had because in the beginning, the board starts pretty sedate. There aren't that many crises and everything, and you have room
although nobody likes you either, so it's like.
Like
40% approval rate.
Yeah, no one likes you, but it's not like, war. It doesn't, like, jump you into that. But, like, so you're so let's say, like, the Middle East, because I think there's always going to be one area that has, like, more than other stuff, like in terms of the rogue states and the civilian unrest or whatever you have. So if something pops off, and I'm thinking the Middle East right now because of what's happening in current events, but, like, if that gets hot, you have to orient multiple turns, multiple actions. You have to stomach multiple failed rolls or, like, sacrifice AP. So that's what ended up happening. Was like, okay, I always think, and I think in terms of playing well, and I made this mistake, and this wasn't managed till later. Like, my instinct as a gamer was like, if I miss a roll, that's bad, and I'm going to use my AP to re-roll. And that's just not the way to approach this game. Like, there are times where it's like, you rolled, you miss it, that's nothing, and then you have to move on to the next thing. But so that was like a side thing. But to the point of, like, you do have to, generate 5 different things. You have to maybe swap by your Secretary of State. You have the wrong bonuses in your Secretary of State, and there's an action where you could do. It's like, okay, I'm gonna swap you. I'll get another one. Maybe you have to, build up your what is it? What's the one where it's like you can get that kind of global 1 DRM, like you put the track on the way down, and you get like a big DRM. I remember doing that, but I forget exactly what it was called. Anyway, so, like, that's multiple turns too. And all while you're doing that, the Middle East is cooking. It's like, oh no, what's going on here?
Yeah. So actually, Paul, I wanted to ask you, like, talk about the kind of ship of state aspect. Like, you've been playing it with Brent, who, like, actually knows things about the ship of state from, like, that sort of bureaucratic end as opposed to, like, elected. So what did he think about it?
Yeah. Two observations. One first on the play time and the commitment the game requires, which I think captured, right, is pretty heavy and pretty significant. I will say one nice thing. I don't tend to go this route, but I know a lot of gamers do. There are a lot of self-contained scenarios you can play. So you don't have to play the whole damn thing. you can play certain moments of crisis and have a much shorter game experience, maybe even one that's manageable in one long day. And I think there will be more scenarios created for the game, including by fans. I've even seen some people say, and I think they're right, that you could adapt this to an earlier period of American history and very different presidencies. So, what would this game look like in the era of Lincoln or FDR?
You could adapt this
God
like
knows.
multinational corporation. Like this could be Exxon if you really, really wanted it to be. Like, any corporation that is, or Apple. Like you can make this the Apple game where it's like, okay, I'm trying to get into China and like I'm trying to find India and everything. Like it would be like a stretch with everything, but that's the kind of like scope you're looking at with this engine.
Yeah. So, but reskinning the game for any of those earlier eras, God knows how long it would take to actually implement the game. It took this one long enough. And I think one of the things I admire about it is, when I look at game designs, whether they work 100% or not, I always look at degree of difficulty. Like, what are you attempting to model? What are you attempting to capture? And that's what I admire. I followed this game from the earliest rumblings about its existence. I waited. I got to a point, of course, where I thought it's never going to come. I'm just going to forget about it and play other things. And when it finally showed up on my doorstep, it just blew me away how much was in the box, as we've said. I did get Brent's take on this. I just want to share with you something he said. He wrote me, Mr. President, on Mr. President, no game can truly capture the push and pull and give and take at the highest levels of government, but this one does an admirable job. Like I've said before, it almost reminds me of work. It does a great job of forcing players to not necessarily look for the best solution, but the least bad. It also shows that many problems have no immediate solution, and the best you can do is keep them simmering either for the long term or until an opportunity appears. I really would have appreciated playing this game at Air War College. It forces you to really weigh all the angles. So from his point of view, it captures an awful lot in terms of the policy analysis that he did professionally and the insoluble, intractable problems that he encountered all the time, that nations encounter all the time. So from that point of view, I admire the effort, even where I might quibble with particular implementations.
This is a magisterial game. Like, I mean, and I have my criticisms of it. And it is not a game that is going to be like, hopping off my shelf anytime soon. But I just admiring the craft, admiring the scope and the ambition, and it definitely works as a game, and it is surprisingly simple. Like it's not a hard game to learn, right? Because it's basically seven spreadsheets spread out, right? And it's like, okay, what the cognitive load is in how, like, what do I do? How do the interactions really? It's like, okay, in order to have success in the foreign, solve this problem in the foreign area, etc. Which of these other charts, these individually easy to understand charts, which of these can I manipulate in order to get what I need in order to solve the foreign thing? And then, like, when I solve the foreign thing, what does it get me, and how can I use that back in the domestic sphere? So it's the interactions where the heaviness is. It's shockingly not a. I didn't find this a really difficult game to just learn. Like it wasn't
want to hop in on this, which is, I think that the thing that makes Mr. President such a difficult game to assess in terms of its difficulty level is that there is no one aspect of the game that is that hard.
Right.
It's not a hard game in the sense of playing it. And like, if you just follow the manual, yes, there are lots of things to follow, but actually, like, the layout's super nice. It's like, okay, so here's your action phase 1, 2, 3, 4 final actions. Like, just do the thing, and like you just do it in order. And there's a guide for it. It's really not bad in terms of cognitive load in the moment. It's like in aggregate where it really starts to get you, and in seeing the interactions, as that makes it hard. So it's like I just looked it up on BGG. It's like a 4.19 out of 5 on weight, and I would say that I think that's probably about right, because it is heavy in the sense of putting it all together, but there isn't any one moment that feels that heavy. Does that make sense?
And Liz, that's where having people to play it with really helps.
Yes,
because having a foreign policy military person, they can focus on those systems and mechanics. The domestic person focuses on those, so that nobody's cognitive overload is too much. And I think playing it collectively teaches you to appreciate counsel and advice. I really love that aspect of the game. I know it's a solo game. I bought it because it was a solo game, and I've enjoyed it that way, but nowhere near as much as I've enjoyed it playing it with, like-minded friends. And we don't agree on everything, right? We sometimes make the wrong call, and at the end of the day, they'll defer to me and say, "Well, you're the president, right?" They'll put it on me.
Oh no.
But I love the fact that the game, as you're all pointing out, no one part of it is too rough, but you put it all together, it can be rough. And there are also unintended consequences. Some things you do have blowback that you only are clear on later on in the game. And I think that is a realistic aspect of the game.
For sure.
I like that element.
I mean, so like you couldn't do what you were describing, like have the 3-person solo game as like, I don't know, Feast Road in there. I mean, you could if everybody knew the game, but like it's 3 people, like having those 3 people have to know everything about the entire system and like all the interactions in order to get Euro, and then we're talking about it. In Mr. President, you can like the foreign policy can really just send them the foreign policy. And that system exists separately. And it's like, okay, there are certain things that have to happen in the air, but they don't have to know the system for it. They just have to know, like, okay, how much DRM do I get on this roll? how many can the economy produce enough military assets that I can bring to the area? That's all I need to know. I don't need to know how you did it. I don't need to do anything that will affect you. Just like, how many plays do I get? How much stuff do I get? And so the systems are independent. The output of the systems interact, but the systems are independent. Where in a Euro, the system is interdependent, if that makes sense. And so that definitely shifts the paradigm. And that's why, like we mentioned the BGG thing with weight, it's such a funny thing in terms of like, this is such a different game than so many other heavy Euros out there that it's almost like weird to score that with the same grade. If that makes sense.
Yeah. Paul, do you have any other final thoughts before I pivot to a broader topic?
I hope.
Go ahead.
I have some theme thought, but go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead now, and then I'll build on
as long as we're talking mechanisms, I finish the mechanism stuff, and then I'll get to just overall assessment of theme.
Maybe this feeds into you a little, Jason. In terms of theme and sort of ideological orientation of the game, again, I think it's pretty agnostic to the domestic left and right politics. I don't think it wants to get into the weeds on that. That was probably not only a solid mechanism decision, but also probably a pretty smart marketing decision, right? Because this game could be picked up by just about anybody in our very divided country right now. And that person can play the game, sort of with their own ideological spin on what they're experiencing. The part of the game, though, that I think is worth interrogating a little bit is the assumption that on the foreign policy front, where you cannot win, but you most certainly can lose, and I will layer into the possibilities of losing, you can be impeached, you can be removed from office, perhaps unjustly even, but you can be removed from office. So you're constantly worried about that. But in that foreign policy sphere, I think the game leans into the assumption that intervention is a good thing. Now, it does give you options to do military intervention or to do humanitarian style interventions, or to use the United Nations as your mediary in trying to improve situations abroad. So I won't say it is militaristic in the way a lot of classic war games obviously are, but it certainly assumes that the United States needs to be involved in pretty much everything happening around the globe. I do credit the game with sort of making, on a meta level, players reflect on that, right? Because as we're playing our game with my friends, we're asking, like, are these really sound interventions? I mean, we're doing this because it works for the game, but would we really do this in real life if we were in charge? So I think the game invites reflection on these questions, but it does start from the position, right, that the United States presence abroad is fundamentally a good thing and something that you need to embrace if you're going to have any chance of winning the game.
That is exactly where I was going to go with the theme stuff. So I'm people know I'm a leftist. I don't love that term, but whatever. That's a word. And in the tradition of like a Howard Zinn in terms of the history stuff, and very much critical of government and all that kind of thing, especially abroad. So we'll focus on the abroad for this. Mr. President, as much as mechanically, as much as experientially, is a wonderful magisterial game. If you're into this, if you could stomach the things that Paul was talking about in terms of the randomness and the all that stuff, right? So there's so much this game has to offer. As a piece that says something about the American sphere, it is just blue sky, hey geographical, America is wonderful, which is exactly in terms of the parachuting from 2011 or so. That was totally the rhetoric. It's like, we're bringing democracy to Iraq, we're bringing democracy to Afghanistan, we're not bringing anything, we're bringing war, we're bringing Raytheon, we're bringing bombs, we're bringing all these terrible things. Like, so in terms of like American adventure being a good thing, there's no real option to have the game say, okay, I'm going to come over there and I'm going to bring war. And I'm going to come over there and like, I'm going to scuttle peace processes. Like, so that, this is a little bit of a later thing, but there is evidence that in terms of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, that America has played a role in scuttling peace. And you can go ahead and look that up, and all that kind of thing. But like, this is something, it's stuff that, we prolonged war in Afghanistan. We provoked our, relations in the Middle East and, further east. And like, none of that is represented in the game. And so to your point, Paul, like this game, like you say the game invites discussion, but because what discussions to have because of your background, because you've played other games, because you're playing with a Air Force captain, you're playing with people who have had opportunity to bring that in there. I don't think it comes from the game itself. I think if you're just coming in and you had a general regular American education about the government, straight out of the textbook, so to speak. You're not going to have any kind of reflection that America does difficult things overseas. As a matter of fact, when difficult things happen in the world, it's because we failed, as in the role fails, right? So like I messed up, and that's why that was bad. But there's no sense that like, okay, just me being there at all could be triggering the bad things. And then there's like little things in there. So like, you talk about like, representing kind of military assets present in areas like, different, the ships and the planes and stuff. Like, I think the game wants to say, okay, well, we have a heavy presence or a light presence or whatever it is. We have a heavy presence in almost every sphere that is represented, like in real life. We have hundreds of bases, not just like assets, but bases around the world, surrounding all the places where we identify as difficult, Iran, Iraq, and different places, in a China Sea, all that kind of thing. So like we're already there in real life, but in the game, it's like, oh, we have a light presence. And if we decide, we'll put more just to solve a problem. It's like, oh, come on. And anyone who is a critic of American empire, as I am, is it's just gonna leap out of you. And the game can say what it says, but I think the game doesn't present it with any kind of questioning. Any kind of questioning the player has to bring it from the previous experience. I don't think it's in the game.
I think some elements of the game invite the questioning. The events I'll point to, and obviously I couldn't list all the events. I haven't even encountered them all yet. That's how many there are. But some of them do point to missteps on the part of the United States, leading to crises and problems. And sometimes the misstep is just hardwired into the event. Other times it's the result of a die roll. So you would roll against, for example, your Secretary of State's ratings and things like that, and see if there was a mistake that created more harm than good. So there are aspects of the game that I think actually get at that. Vis-a-vis democracy abroad and governmental systems, the game mechanically tries to be agnostic on that, except to the extent that in each region of the world you have two things being measured. One is regional alignment, so how close the region trends towards the United States as an ally or partner, which is an aggregate description, right? It doesn't presume that every nation in that region loves the United States, but it's gauging, relatively speaking, right? How much goodwill is there to the US? And then the other thing being measured is stability. So that's its way of getting at governance. And in that way, it's a little bit similar, I don't know by intent, but a little bit similar to Volko Ruhnke's original game Labyrinth, which was his pre-coin game and is a really interesting game in its own right. And it was very focused on the question of stability abroad. It didn't really get into the weeds on what form of government different countries have abroad, but how stable the region is. Now, to Jason's point, the presumption of Mr. President is still that an American presence of some kind or another, right? Be it diplomatic, military, economic, whatever, or all the above, somehow or other that is beneficial.
Bring stability, right? It's like that's how you encourage stability, is by increasing our economic, whatever it is. And that's another one. So like the game does model on some level, like in the most abstract way, kind of like economic intervention.
And can I throw in one thing? Yeah, and I'm sure you'd be interested in this too, right, Jason? It also shows the Russians and Chinese exerting their influence in a similar way abroad.
Yes, I was going to bring that in, so I'm glad you did.
Yeah, and it's potentially another, ideological assumption made by the game, right? Is that among the superpowers, let's say the big three, right? That there is a zero-sum game at work, and that only one of those three powers is going to win. And so you're constantly trying to stop Chinese and Russian influence from growing around the world. And so the game's assumption is they're doing the same things that your superpower is doing in order to exert, spheres of influence. And I think the game just assumes that's the way of the world. It doesn't question that way of looking at geopolitics.
Yeah, and if you know what's going on, so like take the example of China, the Belt and Road Initiative. So like they are going to Africa and they're going to these other places. They're trying to establish diplomatic ties. Matter of fact, I just read something where China is trying to intercede as a diplomat. They interceded in the Middle East, and they've tried to intercede in this current conflict, in specifically to Israel. But they've they managed like discussion between Saudi Arabia and Iran. So like on the diplomatic front, and like in Africa, there's all these like they build airports, they build roads, and all that kind of thing. Like none of that is modeled. Like basically they're these like they're red chits, and like that advancing on the track is like a total bad thing. I guess from the perspective of the game, yes, because you're in this dashboard, you're steering the ship of state, and like them increasing will put friction into what we're steering. But the game can't handle the idea that like maybe the people on the ground might be benefiting from increased Russian or Chinese intervention, whether it's whatever they're doing. The game, I mean, so I don't love criticizing a game depending on like when it's not there, because there's already so much in here. It doesn't fit, but it is. I just want to kind of put it out there that like, because of the perspective of the game, because of where the game chooses to situate the player, who's an agent, who's not, certain things are going to be said, and certain things are almost like impossible to be said in the game unless the player reads it in. And something like the US operating in some kind of like multipolar world where other countries have their interest and it's not necessarily antithetical to the US, that's not able to be built into the game system.
There is one mechanic that I find interesting and kind of gets at the agency of other nations a little bit, not to the degree Jason's talking about. I think I agree with him that it definitely is a game from the perspective of great powers, right? Like a lot of war games tend to be. But it does get into your relationships with allies throughout the world. So your relationship with the Gulf states and Saudi Arabia, Israel, Japan, South Korea, you name it. And to some degree, one thing I actually like about the game is some of those allies and your adversaries like Iran, North Korea, etc., rogue states, they can take autonomous action. They can take unilateral action and do things you didn't exactly ask them to do, or maybe don't want them to do. So the game does try to capture some of that agency, but that's not its guiding perspective. Let's put it that way. It's from the perspective, the aerial perspective of a superpower.
And a superpower that does good things, a beneficial superpower, a beneficent superpower. And that is very much a thing I don't know if this game can handle the questioning, but it is valuable to put it out there that like this game does not question. I don't think so in any fundamental way. Like you mentioned the event deck, like you have to dive into the event deck. You already have to be in, like, year 2, turn 16 in order to like, oh wow, negative America event. That's different than having it emerge from like chit placement and dice rolling a narrative. So in terms of like that core mechanical stuff that's like independent of what I read on cards, yeah, it's a little, whatever criticism that have American Empire are definitely buried in somewhere.
Yeah, I think this actually comes around to like the larger issue too of, it's when you're critiquing a game, right? You have to determine what you think the game is trying to say and then decide whether it does a good job of that. And then you also have to look at that wider context and like, what doesn't it say that maybe it should have? how do
Absolutely.
we, how do we kind of assess for what is good? So I would say that in terms of teaching plate spinning and all the different things a president might have to worry about, I actually think Mr. President is great for that. Like if you want to look at like if you were the president of the United States, what kind of crap would you have to think about every day? And like maybe you'd have more and less reliable people. Like I love that even things like you weren't charming enough at the State of the Union
Yeah.
can happen. It's fantastic, right? But then yeah, when you look at these kind of wider, it's a very America centric game in the sense that it doesn't question our business being in other parts of the world. And like, I consider myself very pro America. I consider myself very much a patriot. But I also think that we live in a world with a bunch of other players and that, this kind of continues that narrative of like, we're the
Mhm.
only country that matters. And, I think it's cool. But I also do think that y'all's criticisms, make a lot of sense. That
Yeah.
said, do you think, I mean, I don't know, Jason, you said it. I don't know that Mr. President could contain any more than it already does, frankly. So I guess kind of where I wanted to go for the next part of this conversation is do you think that Mr. President earns its weight and
Mm.
earns its size? Is it too bloated and it's just too much, or does it have to be as big as it is to encompass the things that it does?
Yeah, Paul.
Oh, yeah, I think it earns its weight if you're into this kind of experience. That is an important caveat. It's not a game for everybody. I think it's a game people should give a try, right? They might discover they have an appetite for the plate spinning. And I think, given all the things it's trying to model and simulate in contemporary geopolitics, it has to be as complex it is, and that still falls short, as we're seeing, right? Falls short of the actual reality of things. I mean, any game that claims to be a perfect simulation of anything is going to fall short somewhere. But for me, it earns the time it requires. It earns the footprint on my table. It earns the engagement and thinking. I can see ways to use it in a classroom that excite my mind. But you have to make that decision carefully, right? Is it the right investment for you? Because it is a lot of overhead in terms of all the systems you have to manage.
Yes, yes, yes. So I don't use that word lightly. I've never called a game magisterial in my entire reviewing career. I mean, maybe like a Lacerda game, one of those kind of things. But even then, like we talk about Lisboa, like enjoying that Lisboa. Like, I mean, this is a step beyond because Lisboa is the as an example of Vital Lacerda game, very heavy Euro. People are gonna at me. It's like, oh, that's not the heavy. It's like to me, it's heavy. So but it's covering like a moment in time. Like Lisbon has been destroyed by an earthquake, and they're trying to build it up. Very small. Like the scope and the ambition of the game. You're talking about 20 years of the presidency, and you're talking about like Paulo mentioned the scenarios. Like the scenarios are lifted from real life, as they say on the TV, right? It's like 2020 is a scenario, and who's the president at that point? You kind of read that in. So like the game system can accomplish all that, and so I think um, my where my big asterisk on this, and the where I get frustrated, it really does come down to the dice rolls. I have a rule generally: the longer a game is, the less stomach I have for randomness. And not just like input randomness, like give me the cards, give me the crises, give me the chits, give me the whatever. That's all fine. I'll react to all that. But the output randomness, I roll a die and I fail and I get nothing. Right. And then if I use my AP, which is not always the right thing to do, and I've had a situation or two, doesn't happen too often, but when it does, it's really crappy. That nothing. And you mentioned the impeachment, right? Like the impeachment, that really comes down to a roll. Like sometimes you're there's a very high stakes roll. It can only have so many DRMs, and if you miss the roll, you're done. And I don't know, like that seems like very much kind of a old school war gamer. Like I missed the roll for my infantry, so I guess I'm gonna get rolled and all that kind of thing. And there seems to have been a tolerance set a build up in that community uh, that I just don't. I can't. And at the end of the day, like when I talk about a heavy game, uh, should a heavy game come down to that?
On the
Should
impeach
a heavy game be as prone to that? And yes, you could do a million things to mitigate and you know all whatever else, but like really, but at the end of the day, it does come down. Certain things come down to die rolls, or like success to die rolls can mess you up, and so like I don't know, like I had a real time. I had a real hard, and I have a big appetite, as you say, Paul. But that one just was a really hard pill to swallow for me at the end of the day.
On the impeachment front, because you mentioned that, I do think it doesn't come down to just one role, because the impeachment process and the scandal
Right,
might
it's a
be
process,
for
right?
you.
Right.
It
Right.
might be for one of your cabinet members. It might not be about you. It might be your VP, whoever. But the scandal kind of rolls out in stages, so it takes some time before you're actually finished, right? Before
Right.
you're out of office, and you may be able to put the brakes on it and kind of kill the scandal. What I have found, though, and maybe this is maybe your experience too, if you're in the tank in your relations with Congress, and in the tank in your relations with the media, all of which are tracked, and in the tank in your relationships with your own party,
Mhm.
if those three things are really low, it's hard to reverse that, and any scandal is probably going to just roll on down the line to you being in serious trouble or losing the game.
Right.
So there can feel like situations in the game, and this may be just one of them, where you feel you don't have much way to squirm out of it. You don't know how to reverse course sufficiently. So there can be a slippery slope feel to some of the aspects of the game.
Right. And so to your point, right? So I didn't want to make it seem like, okay, a card of impeachment and then you have to roll. That's not it. It really is like, okay, you know, certain conditions in the game will check against how you're doing, like your cabinet effectiveness, right? And you know, mentioned before, like the domestic situation, is there a good economy? Is there good, you know, so like a lot of that will, you know, see, so you have a lot of chances to shore that up. I guess like the game can be prone to, let's say, like you had a couple of those bad rolls in some really key spots. Like you said before, there's sections, right? So like you really do have you know, one chance, quote unquote, to shore up that what you call your congressional support, let's say. And let's say you just missed that role. He's like, okay, you know what? I can't do everything. And then, you know, something else comes along. So there are certain key points that you may have hit or miss, and you have to like decide whatever. But then something will come in later in the game that just hits you right in your soft point. And
Mhm.
real and you didn't prepare for that because the game
Yeah.
doesn't show you that coming. In a Euro game, you can kind of see these things coming because there's not as much randomness. Is like, okay, if you know, I'm going to hit a point where I don't have enough sheep, and then I'm gonna need a lot of sheep, and I'm gonna run into a wall. I see that coming. But like in this game, okay, I missed a couple rolls when it comes to like that congressional support of whatever it is, and then wham, I didn't need to get hit by that card that's an impeachment, but I happened to get hit by the impeachment, hit me right in the nads, and I really can't do anything about it. So it's an additive thing, but
Mhm.
I mean, I know there's a slight different point than what Liz was talking about in terms of the heaviness, but like it's a if you're gonna call something kind of heavy, right? It's very dissonant to me to call something heavy that is at the same time open to this kind of like bottom falling out. I
At
feel
the
like.
same time, though, like, I mean, this is sort of meta, I suppose, but politics as a whole is like that. I mean, think about all the money and effort that went into like the Howard Dean primary, and all he had to do was go, yeah, on camera one time, and it
Yeah.
was
He was
over. It
done.
was over. You know, or you think,
But
you know,
this
there's
isn't
all
the
kinds
Howard
of
Dean game. I don't want to play the Howard Dean game. I want to spend 20 hours playing Howard Dean.
but like, you know, I mean, think about how a presidency can be going well, and then maybe there's a natural disaster, or there is a bombing, or there is, you know, drought in a key part of the country, and then all of a sudden they're a bad president.
Yeah.
Like, you know, it's a pretty common thing, I think, in human life.
To your point, Liz, and this I think is a nice design choice in the game. You have plenty of events that are one and dones. You know, they
Mhm,
happen, they get discarded, end of story. You may or may not see them in your game, but it also has quite a lot of events that they call cascading events
mhm.
that appear, and then they will go into another pile and possibly recur with more implications and problems that flow out of the initial issue. And there even can be a third deck that they go into, and then they cycle out again and give you more headaches. So you kind of see a rolling crisis aspect of the sort you're talking about, and it does give you some hint, right, that if you don't prepare for the next time this event comes your way, right, the ramifications of the first thing that happened, natural disaster, political crisis, whatever it is, if you don't prep for that, you may lose the game, or you may have a lot of other problems that you didn't want. And I've found sometimes I can't keep track of all the things that could cascade out. And then it cascades out, and I remember, oh, yeah, that happened. And we didn't really follow up on the implications of that. And now we're paying the price. So, to some degree, the game can shaft you. It can certainly do that. And in other respects, you shaft yourself because you just forgot that this thing was simmering, and you got distracted by 20 other things that are all important too. And that's just kind of the game. Again, you'd have to have an appetite for that, fun house quality of it, or how fun that's going to be. To me, it is fun to deal with those issues, but it wouldn't be everybody's cup of tea.
So speaking of appetite, I will say, so y'all kind of gave your assessment. I would say, in terms of, is it worth all of this, right?
Mhm.
I'm going to say yes, in the sense that the game is never leaving my collection, but no, in the sense that I'm not going to set this thing up more than maybe once a year.
Mm.
Does that make sense? Like, but that said, Paul, if y'all decide to have another administration and you need another cabinet member, I do kind of want to play.
We will likely do another at some point. Yeah, and it is much easier to do it online. I will be shocked if this isn't implemented digitally in a more full and rich way
Mhm.
at some point. I think it's just crying out for that, because a lot of people will not have the table space for this.
Yeah, do
Speaking to
not
your
get
point
this
of
at your
like,
little table.
speaking of to your point of like the fan base scenarios and all that kind of, there is second edition stuff cooking,
Yeah.
and we are going to get like more iterations of this. I mean, this is, I mean, look, for what it is, if you know what you're getting into, it really is a home run. Like it is a massive 400-foot home run. Like I have to admire this stuff. I have some personal problems with it as a a critic of government. I just think it's so blue sky, and it's so like naive and hagiographical that like I have like, so on that end I have a problem with it, and I'm going to continue to articulate my problem. And also just the idea of like, as a game, as a big game that I admit is a huge, like, basically a whole run of a prestige series on an HBO or something. But to have that experience kind of like, I can't incorporate the level of output dice rolling into that experience. It just drops me out of that. So, if that was a little bit different, if there was more mitigation, then sure, maybe that's my Euro brain talking. But those two issues kind of, but those are all personal. For the most part, I can totally, if you're interested, totally recommend checking it out.
Paul, any last thoughts about it? I want to ask one more general question before we wrap it.
Yeah, go ahead.
So basically, we talked a lot about Mr. President, so this will be a shorter aspect of the discussion than I intended. But I did want to talk about kind of length creep and size creep, and how do you know that a game is really worth it versus how do you know if it's bloat? I would say that in the sense of what Mr. President is trying to do, yes, it's big, but I wouldn't necessarily call anything I've experienced so far. And I need to play it more times to be sure, right? Bloat.
Mhm.
But what does the game have to be doing to justify a large size or a heavy weight?
It has to engage you. Like, I like, this game is engaging, and like, so I can, like, I've been at half-hour games that are bloated. you know,
That's true.
we've reviewed plenty of them, Liz.
Yeah.
But this game is 20 hours, and even though I felt, because I have a picadillo about the dice rolling, and it really mostly comes from the dice rolling, the output dice rolling. I mean, I have that person picadillo, but like, if I didn't, which a lot of people don't, then this game offers so many opportunities for engrossment. Like, this is what Paul was saying in terms of, how, like, what brings you back again and again and again. It's like, okay, a totally different adventure, a totally
Mhm.
different way to manage the crises, and a totally different way that the administration builds out. Like, I can, I mean, even something as simple as like the secretaries of state, like, they make up all the names. But like, if you get into it, you remember who Secretary of State was. You remember that, like, okay, this person got into a scandal and then they were fired. And like, when you get to a point, maybe this is a little bit more, drilling down a little bit. Like, if a game has quote unquote characters, and you remember the characters, you remember their names, like, that's not bloat at all to me. Like, and I don't care if I was there 4 days.
Mhm.
I've played like giant dungeon crawlers that are like bloated as heck. I've taken MMOs that are bloated as heck because I don't care about the characters. But like, I've also played those games where, like, I remember when my Squire Phil or whatever it is, leapt into the chasm and saved the party. And this is the same thing with this game. Like, I remember when my Secretary of State did this. I remember when, Iraq was a constant problem and I had to like kind of manage. They become a character in a sense. So like, it is a total experiential thing for me. And I think Mr. President, I think that's where a lot of the dev at the time came from. You could tell it's just totally intentional, layering stuff in to enable that story to come along and in that engagement at the end of the day.
Yeah, for me, and I mentioned this earlier, and obviously not inventing this idea, right? But the emergent narrative power of the game is what draws me to most games, frankly. And I'm glad you mentioned Jason Lisboa, because I think that's a great example of an emergent narrative too. And the beauty of that game to me is that it illuminates for people an aspect of Portuguese history and the history of natural disasters in Europe and their impact on civilian populations. That illuminates something that most games never even think about, let alone explore in depth. So I'm looking for games that that do that for me, that teach me something, or at least make me curious enough about something to learn more about it. Did I know something about that earthquake before I played Lisboa? I did, because I had taught Voltaire's Candide. And Voltaire's Candide was inspired in part by the twisted reaction to the carnage that Voltaire saw in a lot of his fellow Europeans, people who are basically explaining it away as God's will, and oh, too bad. And so he wrote Candide as a kind of rage-filled rejection, of that kind of thinking that all is God's plan. So having read that, I kind of knew something about the earthquake, but I had never thought deeply about the on the ground impact of it and what it would mean for Lisboa to rebuild. And the game illuminated that for me. So that's what I'm looking for in games. And to your question, Liz, because I did some thinking about it when you asked in the email, and just looked at my own collection of games. So take that for what you will, right? Because it's
yeah, you're a heavy gamer. That's why you're here.
Well, I'm a heavy gamer, and it's confirmation bias, right? I look at my own collection. It's a big collection. But I noticed a couple of different categories of things that I would consider heavy or a big investment or, a challenge. One would just be something like a legacy game, but those aren't necessarily complicated. They're just long, right? They have lots and lots of chapters. So something like Pandemic Legacy or Assassin's Creed, Brotherhood of Venice, things like that, right? They're just going to take a long time to play. Then you have rule systems that are incredibly heavy, but only in aggregate, right? And we talked about this earlier, right? No one part of Mr. President is actually that hard, but you put them all together, it's challenging. Advanced Squad Leader is that kind of game. You will never use all the rules in ASL, but one of the great things about it is you don't need to. You can play simple, short scenarios of Advanced Squad Leader that only use infantry rules and no other complications. And I'm not saying that's an easy game, but it's not as hard as it's historically made out to be. So it's the difference between rules load versus scenario load. And that's a very scenario driven game. I'm thinking too of games that are heavy by scope, time, unit density, rules density, things like Twilight Imperium, which I can play in one day with the right group, but is not for everybody. Or something like World in Flames, which is the next thing my gaming group is doing. It's kind of a bucket list game for us. And it's going to take years to finish. I'm not even making that up. That's why I have some space on my table underneath the top in order to hold this game in perpetuity. Then you have games that are heavy by way of intricacy of interlocking systems, right, and decision space. So think of Europa Universalis, which I know you've covered, Liz. I was on that episode. Lacerda games, I think, work well in that regard. Hegemony, in the last year has shown the power of interlocking systems. And then games that are focused on contingency and overdetermined causation. And I'm thinking here of the coin system in that regard, because what coin did to change card-driven war games, originally, CDGs, when Mark Herman designed them, they were a hand of cards, and the cards were multi-purpose, but you kind of controlled how those cards got rolled out of your hand, right? Good or bad, you kind of control the flow. But in a coin game, there's only ever one card up at any time, right? So this is the issue that everybody's going to have to deal with. And you don't know the one that comes after it, or you may know the one that comes after it, but not the one after that. So games that highlight contingency and highlight the fragility of your decision making. I think these are all different ways that games can be heavy. And I love all of those, but I'm an Omni gamer and I'm not pretending that's everyone's taste.
That's fair. Yeah, and I think that kind of coming around, so I'll wrap on this too. It's when I think about the weight of a game and whether something justifies it, it comes back to what I said before about how to critique something, right? What is the game trying to do, and how effectively does it do that thing? I have a much higher tolerance for very heavy rule sets and for larger extents of time if the game is giving me something back for that is either just total engrossment, or it's making a point that's really interesting to think about. And I don't think that those things are necessarily dependent on the weight of the game. I think that it could be as light or as heavy as it needs to be. It just has to do something that makes me feel like I spend my time well. So I actually really, I've played Price of Power a couple times now, the Europa Universalis board game, and my God, I love that game. And I'm just hooked on it. Like, I'm just completely riveted to whatever is happening the entire time. And the entire time can mean that we started at noon and we played until 7 p.m. Very few games have that effect on you, to be honestly. It's hypnotic. So that's how I know, right, that it's worth the wait. And I sort of feel the same way, like when Mr. President's going, that the term that I played, there were points where it was hard to stop because I just wanted to keep going. Right. And so it's like, ooh, like I really need to eat now, or like, ooh, I really need to like feed the cat now, or but it's that quality I think that I'm looking for in a high
Yeah.
investment game.
Yeah, I think like in terms of its construction, I think Mr. President was very intentional about the different moments. So at the beginning, it's you have your little things, and then the crisis deck is constructed like there's certain decks that are tiered, so like so they'll come here, it'll come here, to come here. So like I think there was just a ton of intention. Okay, year one is going to feel like this, year two could feel like this, there's and there's just like there's very a lot of thought. I didn't get the sense that like a big example of bloat come to the adventures side. Tainted Grail was a game from Awakened Realms, and there's a core there, right? And they wanted to get that core across. The core is very good, but then they also want it to be a big game. So it's like, let's take this core and go here, and take this core and go here. And it's like, okay, what are you doing with that core? How is it developing? You're kind of trusting that going here and going there is gonna be interesting for the player, but you're not really giving me anything. And that's where it turns into bloat. That's where it turns to like, okay, you're not, there's not a lot of intention in terms of like, well, what kind of fun am I going to have? What kind of story am I going to develop? It's just
Right.
more. Right.
Yeah.
And I never, ever got the sense in Mr. President that it's giving me more for just more, for more sake. Every single element, and that I haven't counted. I haven't played to the extent of Paul have, but that I haven't counted. I've seen in streams and all kind of thing. Everything seemed intentional. Here, you're gonna have this little wrinkle now, and react to that and respond to that, and etc. And so that's a big difference too, and that's a part of why I say this is a quote unquote magisterial game, because the level of craft that went into even just at the end, even the little side things that happened, I just feel like so much was put into it, and it shows.
I would second so much what Jason's saying there. And just as an alternate history, thought experiment, if this game were crowdfunded, how would it have been ruined? Because I think a lot of the bloat we're talking about is connected to a certain model of crowdfunding that we've all seen, right? Where more and more gets layered on.
More
And sometimes
characters,
it's
more
stuff
scenarios,
that,
more
right.
more
And
more
sometimes
little
it's
adventures. Yep.
And sometimes it's stuff that should have been in the base game, and other times it's stuff that you didn't need at all. Right? Didn't need to be there, but you had to justify the stretch goals. And I think this game is, in this way, a game of an older time, and was designed without that sort of crowdfunding mentality around it. And before we would end, I would mention to Jason's earlier point about taking the perspectives of other countries into account, right? Something Mr. President, by design, isn't ultimately trying to do, right? I wonder if it will inspire other people to design their own games, with the lens of another nation, or another community, another people. And the one that I mentioned off screen earlier is really excellent. It's a solo game. It's short, it's rich, but not very complex. And you can play it in an afternoon. It's called Rogue State by Mike Molyneux. And it is all from the perspective of North Korea, from the end of World War II to the present. So basically, it's playing a Mr. President style game from the standpoint of a regime that in Mr. President is deemed to be only a problem. And when you play Rogue State, you actually start to see the complexity of North Korea's situation. And it doesn't sugarcoat the abuses of that regime in any way, but it also shows that it is in a very tenuous position vis-a-vis, the world political scene. And so I think the more games we see developed that adopt a Mr. President style approach, the more we start to address the blindnesses or shortcomings, of the design as we have it, which I think is pioneering in its way, but should be a first word and not the last word.
Mm-hmm.
Nice.
Absolutely.
I think that's a great place to stop this large Mr. President discussion. But I think we really could go on. We could go on as long as it takes to play a game of Mr. President. We could do like
an
extra life set. But what else have y'all been playing recently that brings you joy, Jason?
I just got so Solitaire from Morton Red Pedersen is a little tiny game from Impatience. And I'm good friends with the outfit over there. I get sent the copies of Solitaire and Siberian. So Siberian, have you gotten a chance to play that, Liz, yet? Or
no, I need a copy. So
okay, so we're gonna continue our review of the Universe.
We'll have to re-rank
Siberian. I got Solitaire at the same time, and I enjoy Solitaire way more. This is not an Universe game, but it's in that spirit. It's small, it's quick, and I love it. It's this you're playing, it's in Danish folklore, right? So you're playing like this little badger creature, the Watger, and it's very simple. You have like a cards that are laid out, 7 oversized cards, 6 oversized cards, a forest laid on a clock symbol, and then you have a river of cards that represent the denizens of the forest that are helping you, and you're drafting those cards. But each time you draft those cards, you could trigger the Gamla Eric, which is like this this evil figure. So you're drafting a card, you're using the cards to defeat minions, and so you have to use enough cards in a way that doesn't trigger the Gamla Eric too much. So this is a very delicious push-pull. And also there's a deck thinning thing where the more you use your minions, the more they disappear, and then the Gamla Eric cards are going to coming. So by the end, your deck is all Gamla Eric cards, and you're barely holding on. And it's this very delicious tension, small game. It's excellent. I just got delivered Earthborn Rangers, but I can't wait to get into. So I recently had a design crunch with I think I've mentioned a couple times. I'm designing People's History United States, the board game. That's ongoing. We've ripped up 4 different designs, and we're on. Very hard nut to crack, but I had a design kind of rush. So based on Solitaire, actually, I was inspired by that game and brought some concepts in. And then so that's done. And I'm also, unfortunately, that the Israeli conflict in Palestine is taking a lot of my attention. So I'm reading up on it, listening to a lot of podcasts. So once I get through that part of my, intellectual life, I'm going to dive right into Earthborn Rangers, and I can't wait for that.
Nice. Paul?
So I've got 2 new or newish ones going, and one that's older, but just I'm loving discovering, or rather rediscovering it. The newer ones, one would be Almoravid, which is part of the Levian campaign series that Volker Runke has embarked on. And much as he did with the Coin series, which certainly shook up the wargaming world and continues to be debated by the wargaming world, he did something similar with Levian campaign, which is showing its resiliency as a system across periods and contexts. And its basic focus, right, is the logistics of medieval warfare, the difficulty of keeping armies in the field, the difficulty of maintaining feudal relationships between all these various lords. It does not assume you just pick your force and apply power and see results, wash, rinse, repeat. It doesn't see it that way at all. Your biggest challenges are logistical: supplies, equipment, cattle, provender, you name it. All the elements of actual warfare in that period are covered. But what I love about Almoravid in particular is it really, I think, is a pretty sensitive take on the conflict between Muslims and Christians in medieval Spain. And so I think it has a healthy respect for the nuances of that situation that a lot of games that covered those kinds of conflicts before did not. They were historically pretty pro-Christian takes on the conflict. So I highly recommend that series. I also just got and have been soloing, but haven't had a chance to play with people yet. DEF CON 1, which is a game from Asynchron, a French company that has courted some controversy over the years with crowdfunding issues. But finally, DEF CON 1 is released, and basically it's what the designer calls Uchrony, an alternate history of the Cold War, and particularly a Cold War turned hot. So it has 5 blocks represented. You have the Atlantic Alliance, which is basically the US and UK. You have the French Republic on its own. You have the Warsaw Pact. You have the People's Republic of China. And then you have the non-aligned movement, which is basically all the countries that didn't want to get drawn into the Cold War. So it's kind of fascinating, very asymmetrical game. It's a game that allows you to go into heavy kind of military conflict, including nuclear conflict, without a whole lot of rules overhead. It's not a complex game at all. It has its wrinkles and things that I wish were a little different, but I've been enjoying digging into it because it's been promised for a while. And the one that I've revisited is Wir sind das Volk, We Are the People, which is a German design about the tensions between East and West Germany from the end of World War II to the fall of the wall. It's kind of like Twilight Struggle for East and West Germany, but really thoughtful, smart game with a lot of Euro elements, but also some card-driven war game elements. You can even play a 4-player version where you have not only East and West Germany, but also the Soviet Union and the United States. And they make natural alliances, as you can imagine, with East or West Germany, but only one of those 4 can win the game. So there's that built-in kind of coin-style tension between the factions.
Man, I gotta play that. That's awesome.
It's a good game. It's also, you can play it online.
Ooh.
Notice the difference. Tiny game about Danish folklore about a badger running around the forest, and that.
So
I want to play the folklore game.
My game that I've been playing, I was mentioning it before we in our like pre-chat. I played it for the first time yesterday. I've just been waiting and waiting. It's a light game, but not spiritually. It's The Gods Will Have Blood by Dan Dork. He did like this weird little boutique project where he only published 200 copies of this game. He signed and numbered each one. I set an alarm to make sure that I would not miss the crowdfunding, and I backed it when the alarm went off and I was in the car. And I was like, nope, we're not missing this. But it's basically you are responsible for show trials during the French Revolution, and people come up and different things happen depending on the verdict of whether they get to live or die. And you're trying to maintain the legitimacy of the court. You're trying to maintain your own reputation. And you're also trying to save a couple of the cards that are in the deck that are like a past lover or like a friend. But you can lose your soul as the game progresses as well. Like there are just a few little white cubes in the bag that represent mercy, and they can be removed. And so you lose the game by either getting whacked yourself because you played the system and you played yourself, and now you're going to go in the guillotine, or you can lose the game by becoming an utterly soulless monster. And it's very simple. It's like a tiny little deck of cards, maybe like 30 something cards, some cubes, and like a little canvas mat and a couple pawns. That's it.
Is this commercially available? Is it?
I will lend it to you because I trust you to mail it back.
What did we each back most recently? I'm curious about that. What's your latest thing that you've backed? Talking about crowdfunding.
I went in huge on Molly House. I'm pretty sure
I did too.
Beg for a review copy, but I decided not to because I wanted to back Joe's project badly.
Yeah, I did too. That's my latest.
My wife had a Kickstarter. She is a jazz singer, and she backed her debut EP. So I'm gonna say that.
Nice.
No late funding,
awesome.
no anything, but we so this was a couple of months ago, and I helped her do it. She's not a board gamer, she doesn't know anything about this stuff. She comes down, sees my wall, and she rolls her eyes and all that other stuff, but she loves me. But it happens, like I happen to cover Kickstarters and know a lot of people who know about Kickstarter. And she's like, I need to raise money for my project, and I'm like, let's try Kickstarter. So we put together Kickstarter, put together the video, we learned a lot about how it works, and we funded at $7,000. And we paid for a band, we paid for the studio time, the mixing, and the band recording is done. And she's just layer vocal tracks, but we're looking to have a completed album by next year.
Are there stretch goals?
Yeah, right. 7,000 and out. Leave us alone.
Amazing. And then where can each of you be found online? Jason, I think everybody who listens knows, but say it again anyway.
Shelf Stories GBL. I'm still on Twitter, still using it because the other stuff is still growing. But I am on Blue Sky as well, so you can look for me on Blue Sky, Shelf Story GBL as well. And Tuning Down Facebook and BGG user Pope Six this. And my video channel is like I'm kind of putting that to bed for a little while. I think I've said everything I'm going to say, and I'll pump it up whenever there's like something else to say. But my video channel's basically kind of there. For videos, I'm just doing happy fun time stuff in the one-stop co-op shop. I do playthroughs every week.
Nice.
And for me, the best place probably is via email. I'm at paul.wright at villanova.edu. And another option is on BGG, where I'm Paulus, Paul with the US, Borgia, Borgia.
Yes, I also made you join Blue Sky, and you are there as
Paulus. You did. I am now on Blue Sky.
Yeah. Sort of.
Sort of.
And then I, who am terminally online, am on everywhere as Beyond Solitaire. Gentlemen, thank you so much for coming on and talking to me about Mr. President. This was awesome. I really appreciate it. And those of you who are out there, please like, subscribe, comment, and most of all, happy gaming.